a hospital room, a delirious elderly patient, and 3 words that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my own mother. Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. It traps you between loyalty and justice, between the past and the present, between the daughter you've always been and the person you're forced to become. This is my story, and I promise you, nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered. My name is Laura Brennan, and I've been a registered nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago for 12 years. I've seen everything: trauma cases, miracle recoveries, heartbreaking losses. I thought nothing could surprise me anymore, but I was wrong. It was a cold February afternoon when they wheeled in a new patient to the cardiac unit. Mr. Edward Walsh, 78 years old, retired, no family listed on his admission forms. He'd suffered a mild stroke and was drifting in and out of consciousness. I was checking his vitals when his eyes suddenly flew open, wild and unfocused. He grabbed my wrist with surprising strength and started shouting in broken sentences. Most of it was incomprehensible, the kind of confused rambling you expect after a stroke. But then he said something that made my blood turn to ice. Operation Ryan. He kept repeating it over and over. Operation Ryan. My hands started trembling because I'd heard that name before, whispered in the darkness of my childhood home, gasped from my mother's lips during her nightmares. A name she never explained. A name I'd spent 30 years trying to forget. If this story has already hooked you, go ahead and subscribe to the channel now, because what comes next will surprise you even more. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from? I need to take you back to understand why those 2 words hit me like a freight train. I grew up in a modest apartment on the north side of Chicago in the 1980s. My mother, Irina Brennan, born Irina Volkov, immigrated from the Soviet Union in 1979, just before I was born. She married my father, an Irish-American factory worker, and they built what seemed like a perfectly normal American life, but normal was just the surface. At night, when she thought I was asleep, I'd hear her crying out, sometimes in Russian, sometimes in English, and always, that name surfaced, Ryan. I'd creep to her bedroom door and peek through the crack. She'd be sitting upright in bed, drenched in sweat, my father trying to calm her down. When I asked her about it the next morning, she'd smile tightly and say it was just bad dreams, nothing for me to worry about, but the fear in her eyes told a different story. As I grew older, I stopped asking. Some doors, once closed, are meant to stay that way, or so I thought. Standing in that hospital room with Mr. Walsh's words echoing in my ears, I realized my mother's past was about to come crashing into my present. Thank you for staying with me this far. It shows you're feeling what I felt when I lived through this, so go ahead and subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what's coming next changes everything. I couldn't focus for the rest of my shift. Every time I passed Mr. Walsh's room, my heart raced. Operation Ryan. What did it mean? And more importantly, how did this random elderly patient know about something connected to my mother's nightmares? When my shift ended, I did something I'd never done before. I accessed his medical records beyond what was necessary for his care. I know it was wrong, possibly illegal, but I had to understand. His file was surprisingly thin for someone his age. Retired in 2005 from what was listed vaguely as government consulting. Before that, gaps. Long stretches of time with no employment records, no addresses. Red flags everywhere. I dug deeper, using my hospital system access to check his emergency contact information from previous admissions at other facilities. That's when I found it. A note from a decade ago listing his previous employer, Defense Intelligence Agency. My hands went numb. He'd been a spy, or an intelligence operative, whatever you want to call it. And somehow, this man knew about Operation Ryan. The same operation that haunted my mother for decades. I made a decision right then. When he regained full consciousness, I would ask him directly. I needed answers, even if those answers destroyed the life I thought I knew. 3 days later, Mr. Walsh's condition improved dramatically. The confusion lifted, and he became alert, coherent. I volunteered to take his vital signs personally, dismissing the other nurses. When I entered his room, he was sitting up, reading a newspaper. He looked at me with sharp, intelligent eyes, nothing like the delirious man who'd grabbed my wrist days before. I closed the door behind me. Mr. Walsh, I said quietly, you mentioned something when you were admitted. Operation Ryan. His face went pale. He set down the newspaper slowly. Who are you? He asked. Not just a nurse. I told him my mother's name, Irina Volkov Brennan. His reaction confirmed everything. He closed his eyes and exhaled deeply, like a man who'd been carrying a burden for too long. Operation Ryan was real, he finally said. It was a Soviet intelligence program launched in 1981. The Cold War was at its peak, and the Soviets were convinced the Americans were planning a nuclear first strike. They activated agents, some deep cover, some just low-level informants, to watch for signs of attack preparation. His words felt surreal, like dialogue from a spy movie. Except this was my life, my mother's life. And you knew my mother, I said. It wasn't a question. He nodded slowly. I did. Now I want to to hear from you. Where are you watching this story from? Write it in the comments below. It's incredible to see people from so many places following stories like this. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You won't want to miss what happens next. I left the hospital that evening in a daze. For hours, I drove aimlessly through Chicago's streets, trying to process what Mr. Walsh had told me. Finally, around 9 in the evening, I pulled up to my mother's small house in Skokie, where she'd lived alone since my father died 8 years ago. She answered the door in her bathrobe, surprised to see me on a weeknight. "We need to talk," I said. She must have heard something in my voice because she didn't argue. We sat at her kitchen table, the same table where I'd done homework as a child, where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays. I told her everything, about Mr. Walsh, about Operation Ryan, about what he'd revealed. With every word, I watched her face crumble. She aged 10 years in 10 minutes. When I finished, silence filled the room like a physical presence. Then, quietly, she began to speak in a voice I'd never heard before, flat, emotionless, like she was reciting facts from someone else's life. "Yes," she said, "it's true. I was part of Operation Ryan, not a major agent, not some glamorous spy, just a girl from Moscow who got recruited when I was 22 years old because I spoke English well and had family connections to America. They trained me for 6 months and sent me to Chicago with false papers in 79. My mission was simple: blend in, marry an American, get a normal job, and report anything unusual. Factory production levels, military personnel movements, nothing dramatic, just pieces of a larger puzzle." My mother's confession continued, words spilling out after decades of silence. She told me she'd met my father at a community center English class she'd been instructed to attend as part of her cover. He was volunteering as a tutor. "He was kind," she said, with tears streaming down her face. "Genuinely kind. Not like the men I'd known in Moscow. I wasn't supposed to actually fall in love, but I did." She'd sent reports back to her handlers for 2 years. Mostly useless information, she insisted. Nothing that could have hurt anyone. But then she got pregnant with me, and everything changed. She realized she couldn't raise a child in this double life. She couldn't risk me growing up to discover what she really was. So she did something incredibly dangerous. She cut off contact with her handlers, just stopped reporting, stopped attending dead drops, disappeared into her American life. She expected them to come for her, to punish her for abandoning her mission. But they never did. The Soviet Union was collapsing by then, and in the chaos, she slipped through the cracks. A ghost who chose family over ideology. But the fear never left her, she explained. Every knock on the door could be them. Every stranger could be an operative sent to tie up loose ends. The nightmares were her mind's way of processing the constant terror that her past would destroy her present. I left my mother's house that night feeling like I was walking through a stranger's life. Everything I thought I knew about my identity was built on lies. My mother wasn't the timid immigrant who struggled with English and worked as a seamstress. She was a trained operative who'd been sent to infiltrate American society. My father hadn't just met a nice Russian girl. He'd married a spy without ever knowing it. And me? I was the daughter of someone who'd betrayed her country and lied about it for 40 years. The ethical dilemma consumed me. As a nurse, I'd taken an oath. As a citizen, I had responsibilities. Should I report her? She'd been an enemy agent, even if she claimed she never provided anything damaging. But she was also my mother, the woman who'd sacrificed everything, including her identity, her homeland, her entire past, to give me a normal life. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I called in sick to work for 3 days, something I'd never done. I researched statute of limitations on espionage. I read about Cold War reconciliation efforts. I tried to find a moral framework that would tell me what to do, but there was none. This wasn't a case study or an ethical debate. This was my mother's life in my hands. On the 4th day, I returned to work. Mr. Walsh was scheduled to be discharged that afternoon. I found him in his room, dressed in street clothes, waiting for his discharge papers. "We need to finish our conversation," I said. He nodded, like he'd been expecting me. I told him about my mother's confession, about my confusion and anger. I asked him the question that had been torturing me. Did my mother do real damage? Did she hurt people? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me something that changed everything. "Your mother," he said, "was on our watch list. We knew about her almost from the beginning. Her reports were so generic, so useless, that we actually suspected she was a double agent, someone the Soviets sent to make us waste resources tracking her. But then we realized the truth. She wasn't a double agent. She was just a terrible spy who didn't want to be a spy at all. We watched her cut ties with her handlers in 81. We watched her build a life with your father, and we made a decision to leave her alone. She'd chosen America, chosen freedom, chosen her family. We had bigger threats to worry about. In a way," he said with a slight smile, "your mother won the Cold War in her own small way. She chose love over ideology. That takes more courage than you might think." Mr. Walsh's words gave me something I desperately needed. needed: perspective. My mother hadn't been a villain. She'd been a frightened young woman caught in forces beyond her control, who'd found the strength to choose her own path. I went back to my mother's house that evening. She was in her garden, tending to the tomato plants she'd grown from seeds her own mother had sent from Russia decades ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. We sat on her back porch as the sun set, and I told her everything Mr. Walsh had said. She cried, not from fear this time, but from relief. For 40 years, she'd lived waiting for punishment that would never come. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted to lie to you, but I couldn't risk losing you. I couldn't risk you looking at me with the hatred you'd have every right to feel." I took her hand. "You gave up everything for me," I said. "Your country, your identity, your past. You lived in fear every single day so I could grow up safe. That's not something to apologize for." We talked for hours that night, and for the first time in my life, I truly knew my mother. Not the sanitized version she'd presented, but the complicated, flawed, courageous woman she actually was. I made my decision then. I would keep her secret, not because it was legally right, but because it was morally right. Some debts transcend law. Mama. Then my mother passed away 6 months later from a sudden heart attack. She died peacefully in her sleep, finally free from the fear that had shadowed her entire American life. While cleaning out her house, I found a small metal box hidden in the back of her closet. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in Russian, dated from 1979 to 1981. Her reports to her handlers, copies she'd kept for reasons I'll never fully understand. I read them all with the help of a translation app. Mr. Walsh had been right. They were utterly useless. Descriptions of neighborhood activities, counts of cars in parking lots, nothing remotely sensitive. The letters of a woman going through the motions, playing a role she never wanted. I burned them all in her fireplace, watching the past turn to ash. Some secrets are kept, not because they protect the guilty, but because they honor the sacrifices of those who chose love over loyalty to systems that didn't deserve their allegiance. My mother was a spy who became a patriot through the simple act of choosing her family. And that, I've come to believe, is the truest form of courage there is. Son Maika. So what about you? What would you do if you discovered your entire life was built on a secret like this? Write your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know your perspective. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next true stories I'm going to share. And don't forget to watch the next recommended video. I'm sure it'll surprise you just as much as this one did.